Hello. Okay, welcome back to the part 2 of the Gilded Age, when we're focusing on the industrialization. We last left off in part 1 talking about corporations and what those were, and we're now going to be talking about how those corporations pretty much looked like in the Gilded Age, or at least looking at the major ones that led to monopolies, right? So first, let's kind of look at what we're going to be talking about, vertical and horizontal integration. First, most vertical integration. Here we go. There we go. All right, so vertical integration is owning all the steps when you're creating a project. And the person who's most known for doing this is actually Andrew Carnegie, who owned the mines, the transportation, i.e. the rail lines and the steamships, and the mills that produce steel. So in case you do not know, Andrew Carnegie owned Carnegie Steel Company, and that is how he himself made his fortune at that time. So by doing this, he was able to lower the production cost of making steel and increase his own profit. So this is what vertical integration looks like. You have the mines owned by Carnegie Steel, the transportations, i.e. the railroads owned by Carnegie Steel, even the smelting process, making that steel, and refining it, right? So he owned the entire step of that, and he profited largely off of it as well. Now, in comparison, we have what is called horizontal integration. Now, horizontal integration is not buying all the steps in the process, but buying all of that one step of making something. So this is where you're buying all your competition, right? So you have all the steps in finishing your product, and in horizontal, you're buying out all the competition that you're doing for that specific process, right? And the person who did this was actually John D. Rockefeller. He used this to buy up all smaller oil refineries, right? And in the end result of this led him to controlling about 90% of the oil production in the United States. And this is what led to what we call a monopoly, right? So the Standard Oil that was owned by Rockefeller, right? So he didn't do vertical, where he was owning the drilling, the transportation, refinery, and sales. No, what he did is he owned all of the refineries for that oil. So that meant he can charge whatever he wanted from the drilling and the transportation, because no one else could really refine oil, only he could. Here's an example of what you'll see them looking like together. So this is what you kind of see here. You can see that while Carnegie, right, is mostly known for his vertical integration, he's also known for his horizontal integration by buying out other steel mills, and of course Rockefeller did the same. But this is kind of what we see, where vertical buying out the entire process and horizontal is buying out that one step. All right, and this is what, of course, led to what we call monopolies, right? So if you don't know what a monopoly is, it's basically that exclusive control, or therefore the lack of competition within that business field, right? So think about it this way. If you, everyone knows monopoly, right, are owning all the blue properties in monopoly, that means that you're going to get to charge more when people land on that space. And this can mean higher prices, but a lower quality product, right? So that is what happens when you own the entirety of something. You can charge however much you want, because no one else can tell you otherwise. And this leads to what you're talking about. Rockefeller and Carnegie created monopolies in their own fields. Rockefeller controlled all of the oil industry, right? 90% of the oil industry, while Carnegie Steel, that was later called U.S. Steel, controlled 60% of the steel industry. That's a huge market that he's controlling at this point in time, right? So that is what we call monopolies, right? And the reason why that was able to happen is because at this time, the government did not take any action when it came to the economy, right? They believed that government inaction helped businesses grow, which it did. And this process is what we call laissez-faire, right? Let it be, or hands off, right? This is what we do when the government is not looking. We turn around, we pretend we don't see what's happening in the economy, what the businesses are doing. As long as the government benefits from the economy growth, they don't necessarily care about how that growth is happening, right? And overall, many presidents, many governors believed into this, right? The US overall believed in what is called a free market economy. People are free to create businesses and operate without any interference from the government whatsoever. And the best belief was that capitalism works best without any regulation, i.e., no government control, doesn't get to be involved in there, right? So the government took what they called a laissez-faire approach to the economy and businesses. Many government officials ignored same business practices and or benefited from those practices overall, i.e. money in their pockets. Remember, going back to the Gilded Age, it's shining at top, but poor product underneath. So it tarnishes very easily. So let's talk about the pros and cons of big businesses, right? 1. Pro. Large businesses, which means more efficient and lower prices overall. Hiring a large number of workers, that means many people are actually employed. They can produce goods in larger quantities, so there's more of those products on the shelves. And they have the resources for expensive research into inventing new items, which means new technological inventions, more growth, more progress. Cons, however, led to unfair competitive advantage. It often exploited those workers they're hiring, and often most businesses were often unconcerned about the pollution that we're causing. So a lot of negative environmental impacts came out of this as well. You also have an unfair influence on government rules that also later on affected them. Now, I know I talked about Carnegie and talking about the steel and the oil, about being big businesses, but let's also not forget that the railroads were also considered big businesses, right? So what they did is it connected raw materials in the west to factories in the east, right? So that's what they did a lot at the time. And that was what we're talking about with what happened with big businesses is they regionally linked economies together, right? It created thousands of jobs just for the construction of these railroads and the operation of them, right? Running those railroads. And also led to the standardization of time. Before you could be like maybe 5-10 minutes off or an hour off from someone's own clock. But with trains, they had a set schedule, which means they need to have a standardization of time being kept. And this also happened in England as well with their own railroads. It led to a standardization of times. It led to time zones as well, right? Also, you have a decrease in those transportation times. It took less time to travel from one place to another. It also led to a decrease in transportation costs. It was now becoming much more affordable for some people to travel by train, right? You also have railroad companies who consolidated, right? Coming together, grouping into one bigger company. And these bigger companies ended up buying up smaller companies. And what that did is it made it more efficient, yes, but there was less competition overall. And with these companies, these railroad companies consolidating, it led to unfair practices happening as well, which leads to these, right? You have the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, right? Because these railroads were coming together, they often began to charge smaller farmers more money to ship goods than those of larger companies. And this was clearly not fair. And many people began talking about it and talked to their congressmen, right? And it led to the development of this, right? states began to pass laws to stop this. This is kind of the first time that we see the government begin taking action within the economy and in business practices overall. States passed laws, and the Supreme Court, however, what kind of stuff this though? The Supreme Court ruled these laws were initially unconstitutional. And it was until finally the Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act that prohibited unfair practices by the railroads. And this is what later on led to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, that it was meant to enforce these acts. And like I said, this was the first time that Congress actually began to regulate businesses. However, of course, these were just the first steps of these antitrust laws. And many railroads found loopholes to get around these laws in the first place. And this wasn't the only kind of antitrust law. It's kind though. Later on, you also have the Sherman Antitrust Act that came out in 1890. Now, what this did, and it was kind of put in motion by this wonderful lady right here, you have Ida Tarbell. And now Ida Tarbell, what she did is she actually exposed Standard Oil, right? Standard Oil right here, that was run by Rockefeller. And she exposed the corrupt business practices that were happening. And she published it in this novel, in this book right here. So this led to the creation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this was a federal law that was aimed at stopping monopolies and trusts from engaging in unfair practices. And this was an attempt, right? It didn't guarantee it, but it was an attempt to prevent unfair competitive advantages, and it acted as kind of marked a significant change in the attitude of the government and how it went about the abuses of big businesses, right? Standard Oil was the first monopoly the government actually attempted to stop. However, though, many companies found loopholes to avoid this regulation overall. And that, dear students, is the end of today's lesson about the Gilded Age and its industrialization process. If you guys have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to reach out to your teachers. I'm sure we'll all be more than happy to help you. Guys, I wish you guys a wonderful morning, night. Hope to hear from you guys soon. Have a good one. Bye.